By the time Tessa Ward stood in front of the judge, nobody in Mercy Oaks was calling her the night shift angel anymore. Not the aide who warmed blankets before midnight because she knew whose bones ached when the rain came. Not the soft-spoken girl who remembered every birthday, every favorite hymn, every framed photograph tucked beneath a pillow. By then, the town only remembered what she had taken, and Tessa had taken more than money. She had taken phone messages before they reached the bedside. She had folded birthday cards into her apron pocket and told lonely old women their children must have forgotten again. She had changed contact forms and guided frightened hands toward papers they did not fully understand. 9 elderly residents lost their savings. But worse than that, they lost each other. Sons became strangers. Daughters became suspects. Grandchildren stopped being welcomed at the door. Families once bound by holiday dinners now argued over missing checks and why their mother believed no one loved her anymore. And Marion Caldwell, the retired nurse who once told Tessa she had hands made for healing, sat behind the prosecutor, waiting to testify against the girl she had tried to save. The charges sounded cold, but the damage was not. It lived in Eleanor Whitcomb, who could no longer let a caregiver touch her water glass without flinching. It lived in a coworker who lost her job and her name to suspicion that should have belonged somewhere else. It lived in room 214, where the old hallway cat still waited beside a silent bed. People wanted Tessa to look like a monster that day. That would have made the story easier, but she looked tired. Small, almost breakable. 31, in a gray suit, staring at the floor like she was still waiting for someone to tell her she had been good enough. Because Tessa had not been born cruel. She had once been a little girl beside her sick mother's bed, learning that love only stayed when someone needed you badly enough. But pain does not excuse what she became, and loneliness does not give anyone the right to steal another person's family. So the question was never whether Tessa Ward had suffered. The question was how a child who only wanted to be needed grew into a woman who made helpless people believe they had no one left but her. The judge did not raise his voice. That was what Tessa noticed first. He did not need to. The room was already quiet enough for every paper shuffle to sound like a verdict. The prosecutor had finished speaking. The families behind her had finished crying, at least for the moment. Even the reporters along the back wall seemed to understand that there were some stories a camera could not make larger than they already were. Tessa kept her hands folded on the defense table. They were the same hands that had poured water into plastic cups at 3 in the morning. The same hands that had tucked quilts around knees, adjusted pillows beneath fragile shoulders, and held the wrists of people who woke from nightmares asking for spouses who had been dead for 20 years. Now those hands rested under the eyes of a courtroom that believed they had learned how to harm. Across the aisle, Marion Caldwell sat very straight in her wheelchair, her cane laid across her lap like a line she would not cross again. Marion had not looked at Tessa since taking the stand. Not with hatred. Hatred might have been easier to survive. What Marion carried was worse. The grief of a woman who had once seen a wounded girl inside Tessa and had waited too long to admit that wounded people could still become dangerous. When the judge spoke about vulnerable adults, Tessa flinched. Not because the words were false. She knew they were not. She flinched because all her life, other people had found names for what she was before she had found one for herself. Needy. Clingy. Too intense. Too much. The kind of girl who did not know when to let go. In Mercy Oaks, they had finally given her better names. Reliable. Gentle. Patient. Gifted. For a while, Tessa had worn those words like clean clothes. But in court, every good name had been stripped away. And underneath it was the old one her aunt had thrown at her after her mother's funeral, sharp enough to stay buried for years. She just needs to be needed. Tessa stared at the floor until the wood grain blurred. The courtroom disappeared at the edges. Then the judge's voice sank into something lower, something older, until it became the low hum of the box fan in the bedroom where June Ward spent the last 6 years of her life. Tessa was 9 again. The house on Darrow Street always smelled faintly of medicine, damp towels, and the canned soup neighbors left on the porch when they remembered. Her mother's room stayed half dark even in the afternoon because bright light gave June headaches. The curtains were yellow once, but smoke, dust, and time had turned them the color of old paper. Tessa knew how to move through that room without waking anyone. She knew which floorboard complained near the dresser. She knew how far to turn the faucet so the pipes would not knock. She knew to set the water glass where her mother's hand could find it in the dark. By 10, she could tell the difference between a cough that needed a blanket, a cough that needed the inhaler, and a cough that meant she should stand in the doorway until it passed. Adults called her mature. They said it with soft smiles, as if maturity were a medal and not a thing placed on her shoulders because no one else wanted to carry it. At school, Tessa sometimes fell asleep with pencil marks on her cheek. When Mrs. Delaney asked why, Tessa said she had stayed up reading. It was easier than explaining that she was afraid to sleep through her mother calling her name. Because when June called, Tessa mattered. When June needed water, Tessa had a purpose. When June reached for her hand, Tessa became necessary. And in a house where her father had already proven that people could leave without turning back, being necessary felt safer than being loved. Love could change its mind. Need could not. That was the first lesson Tessa Ward learned wrong. Not all at once. Not in one terrible night. It settled into her slowly, through pill bottles lined on a windowsill, unpaid bills under a magnet on the refrigerator, and neighbors praising a child for doing what adults should have noticed she was too young to do. Years later, the state would describe Tessa's crimes in legal language. Fraud, exploitation, obstruction, but none of those words explained the beginning. The beginning was a little girl sitting beside a sickbed, listening for breath in the dark, believing that if she could make herself useful enough, no one would ever have a reason to leave her behind. Before Mercy Oaks, before the gray suit and the witness stand, before anyone in a courtroom tried to measure the damage Tessa Ward had done, there was a narrow house at the end of Darrow Street with weeds growing through the front steps and a porch light that worked only when it wanted to. The neighbors knew the house. They knew the mother inside it was sick. They knew the little girl who carried grocery bags with both arms wrapped around them because they were too heavy for her hands. They knew Ray Ward's truck had stopped appearing in the driveway one spring and never came back. What they did not know, or did not want to know too closely, was how quiet a child could become when she learned that asking for help made adults look uncomfortable. Ray left on a Tuesday. That was how Tessa remembered it, though years later she could not be sure if Tuesday was true or simply the shape her memory gave to abandonment. She remembered his duffel bag near the door. She remembered the smell of gasoline on his jacket. She remembered her mother sitting at the kitchen table in a robe, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug she had not lifted in 20 minutes. Ray did not make a speech. He kissed the top of Tessa's head, told her to be good for her mama, and walked out carrying everything he thought belonged to him. For a while, Tessa waited for the sound of his truck returning. Then she waited for a phone call. Then she waited for an explanation. By the time she stopped waiting, something in her had already learned a lesson no child should learn from a father. People could leave a room while you were still standing in it, and the world would keep moving as if nothing sacred had been broken. June Ward did not fall apart all at once after Ray left. That would have been simpler. Instead, she became smaller in slow pieces. She missed shifts at the Dollar General. Then she stopped driving at night. Then the doctor visits grew longer, the bills turned pink, and the refrigerator filled with medicine bottles that made the kitchen smell bitter when the caps came loose. Tessa learned the house by emergencies. She knew which neighbor might answer the door and which one would pretend not to hear. She knew how to stretch soup with water and how to fold past-due notices under the bread box before her mother saw them. She knew not to mention field trips because permission slips made June cry when there was no money clipped to them. At school, she carried two versions of herself. One version sat at a desk with a spelling book open, hair brushed as well as she could manage, eyes fixed on the board. The other version was still at home, listening for the phone, wondering if her mother had eaten, wondering if the heat had stayed on, wondering if that morning's cough had meant anything worse than yesterday's. Children notice things before adults did. They noticed Tessa did not invite anyone over. They noticed she wore the same sweatshirt 3 days in a row. They noticed she smelled faintly of menthol cream and laundry that had stayed too long in the washer. Some teased her, some avoided her. A few were kind for a week, then drifted back toward easier friendships. Tessa did not blame them. Even then, she understood that need made people nervous. Mrs. Delaney was the first adult who tried to look past Tessa's answers. She taught 5th grade with reading glasses on a chain and a voice that could cut through a noisy room without becoming cruel, She noticed when Tessa's handwriting changed on days after long nights. She noticed when the girl ate half her lunch and wrapped the rest in a napkin to take home. She noticed the way Tessa looked toward the classroom door whenever the office phone rang. One afternoon, while the other children ran outside for recess, Mrs. Delaney asked Tessa to stay behind. Not as punishment. That was what made Tessa suspicious. The teacher closed the door halfway and sat beside her instead of behind the desk. She said there were programs that could help. A school counselor, meal support, maybe a nurse who could check on June. Maybe someone who could make sure Tessa was not carrying everything alone. Tessa listened without moving. The words should have sounded like rescue. Instead, they sounded like invasion. She imagined strangers walking through the house, seeing the sink full of dishes, the unpaid bills, the pill bottles, the laundry in piles. She imagined someone deciding June was too sick to be trusted. She imagined being taken somewhere clean and far away while her mother called for her from a room nobody answered. Mrs. Delaney slid a form across the desk. Tessa looked at the blank lines where a parent's signature belonged. For a moment, she almost reached for it. There was a tired part of her that wanted someone else to know. Someone else to stand in the kitchen and say, this was too much for a child. Someone else to make Ray come back. Or make the lights stay on. Or make June stop apologizing every time she needed help. But there was another part of Tessa, deeper and more frightened, that whispered something different. If other people helped, what was left for her to be? That was the thought she never said aloud. Instead, she smiled the way she had learned to smile at adults who wanted the truth only if it did not require too much from them. "We're okay," she said. Mrs. Delaney did not believe her. Tessa could see that. The teacher's eyes softened with the sadness adults used when they understood more than a child had meant to reveal. But understanding was not the same as action, and Tessa had already learned to fear both. So she lied again. She said her aunt came by every night. She said her mother was getting better. She said Ray called every weekend. She said the lunches she saved were because she liked eating later. Each sentence placed another small lock on the door between her life and the people who might have entered it. Mrs. Delaney kept the form on her desk for a week. Tessa saw it there every afternoon, clipped beneath a paperweight shaped like an apple. It waited for her the way her father's truck had once waited in her imagination. Then one Friday, it was gone. Mrs. Delaney did not stop caring. She asked smaller questions after that. She tucked extra crackers into Tessa's backpack without making a scene. She let Tessa read in the classroom during assemblies when noise made her jumpy. She did what she could without forcing the door open. But Tessa had made her first choice. Not a criminal choice. Not a cruel one. A child's choice made from fear, loyalty, shame, and the desperate need to remain necessary. Still, choices like that leave marks. By refusing help, Tessa protected the only identity she had. She stayed the daughter who knew where everything was, the daughter who could read her mother's face before words came, the daughter no one could replace because no one else had been allowed close enough to try. And with every month that passed, the idea settled deeper inside her. Help was dangerous. Outsiders took over. Love was not something you received freely. It was something you secured by becoming the person no one could manage without. Years later, when elderly hands reached for hers in the dark halls of Mercy Oaks, Tessa would mistake that old lesson for tenderness. But it had not begun as tenderness. It had begun in a fifth-grade classroom, with a form she refused to sign, a teacher she refused to trust, and a little girl too afraid of being rescued to understand that rescue was exactly what she needed. By the time Tessa turned 15, people in the neighborhood had stopped asking whether June Ward was getting better. They asked easier questions instead. "How is your mama today? Do you girls need anything? Is somebody checking in on you?" The words were gentle, but Tessa could hear the distance underneath them. Everyone knew the house at the end of Darrow Street was struggling. Everyone knew Ray Ward was gone. Everyone knew June was sick. Knowing was simple. Staying was harder. So Tessa learned to answer quickly, "We're managing." It became the sentence she used for everything. The kitchen table disappeared beneath clinic forms, collection notices, and church bulletins from people who promised to pray but rarely stayed long enough to help. The television stayed on through the afternoons because silence made the rooms feel abandoned. Tessa grew taller, but not freer. She skipped birthday parties because gifts cost money. She stopped bringing home school pictures after the year June cried because she could not afford the smallest package. At first, Tessa hated being noticed. Then she learned that being pitied had uses. When homework went unfinished, teachers lowered their voices. When she failed a quiz, no one called her lazy. When she snapped at a girl in the hallway, the principal looked at her file and sighed instead of punishing her. Her mother was sick. Her father was gone. Everyone knew. Tessa did not plan to use that knowledge. But pain, once other people recognize it, can become a strange kind of shield. If she looked tired enough, adults stopped asking questions she did not want to answer. If she mentioned a hard night at home, they stopped pressing her about missing assignments. If someone got too close, she could let a small piece of the truth fall between them and watch them step back. It was not cruelty yet. It was survival with a shadow behind it. Somewhere inside Tessa, a dangerous lesson began to form. If people would not give her safety, maybe they would at least give her permission. Permission to fail. Permission to disappear. Permission to be angry and still be called strong. Mrs. Delaney still saw Tessa sometimes in the hall. She would touch Tessa's shoulder and ask how things were. Tessa always said fine. The lie had become polished from use. Other adults were easier to fool. The school counselor called her resilient. A churchwoman called her brave. A social worker who visited once after a neighbor complained wrote that the home was strained but stable. Tessa stood in the doorway that day with clean hair, a calm face, and answers ready before June could become embarrassed. No one saw the rage under the performance. No one saw how badly Tessa wanted someone to refuse the smile. Someone to say this was not fine and they were not leaving just because she knew how to sound convincing. But most adults accepted the version of Tessa that made their job easier. So she became very good at giving it to them. June Ward died near the end of October, when the trees along Darrow Street were dropping leaves into gutters no one had cleaned. Tessa was 70. The funeral was small and damp. Rain tapped against the chapel windows while Reverend Amos Bell read from a Bible with cracked leather corners. People cried softly into tissues. A few women from church hugged Tessa too hard and told her that her mother was at peace now. Tessa nodded because she did not know what else to do with a sentence that helped everyone except the person left behind. Peace for June meant silence for Tessa. No reason to hurry home, no one to check on before sleeping, no voice from the back room giving shape to the day. For the first time in years, Tessa had no one waiting for her. She thought grief would feel like losing someone. Instead, it felt like losing her purpose. After the burial, the relatives came back to the house. They brought casseroles, folding chairs, and opinions. Aunt Lorna opened drawers without asking. A cousin Tessa had not seen in 2 years asked whether June had left any insurance. Someone mentioned the mortgage. Someone else asked if the house was even worth saving. Their voices moved through the rooms as if June had been a problem to settle, not a woman who had spent years shrinking inside those walls. At first, no one asked what Tessa wanted. Then, when they finally did, every offer already had a cage inside it. She could stay with Lorna for a while if she followed rules. She could finish school if she stopped acting wounded. She could sell what little was left if she learned to be practical. Lorna may have meant well. That was the cruel part. She had a spare room, a husband who watched television too loud, and a tone that made charity sound like discipline. She told Tessa there would be no drama in her house. No acting like the whole world owed her something just because she had had a hard few years. A hard few years. That was what they called it. Not a childhood spent becoming useful because the adults had stepped back. Not years of fear folded into chores. Just a hard few years. Then Lorna said the thing that stayed. She just needs to be needed, she told another aunt, not quietly enough. That's always been Tessa's problem. The room did not stop. No one corrected her. Someone kept wrapping leftover ham in foil. For Tessa, the sentence landed like a door closing. All those years of being necessary, and this was what they had seen. Not loyalty, not exhaustion. Not a child doing adult work because the adults had found it easier to praise her than protect her. A problem. That night, Tessa packed 2 garbage bags with clothes, a framed photograph of June from before the sickness, and a coffee can with $83 inside. Lorna found her on the porch and told her not to be stupid. Tessa almost stayed. Pride does not keep a person warm. Anger does not pay rent. She knew that. But she also knew what it would feel like to sleep in Lorna's spare room and hear that sentence every time she opened a door. She would rather be alone than be studied. So she left. For 3 months, Tessa lived between borrowed couches, cheap motel rooms, and the back booth of a diner that let her sit for hours if she ordered coffee. She took shifts wherever she could, cleaning rooms, stocking shelves, folding laundry in a place that smelled of bleach and wet cotton. She told people she was fine before they had the chance to wonder otherwise. Then, one winter evening, she saw the flyer taped to the glass door of a pharmacy. Mercy Oaks Nursing Home. Night shift aides needed. No experience required. Training provided. The words held her there. Tessa did not think of Mercy Oaks as a place full of vulnerable people. Not then. She thought of quiet hallways, closed doors, and people whose families went home when visiting hours ended. She thought of work no one could dismiss as childish. She thought of a building where someone might call her name and mean it. For the first time since June died, Tessa felt something close to direction. Not hope exactly. Hope required trust. This was simpler than hope. It was need, and need was something Tessa understood. Mercy Oaks did not look like the kind of place that could change a life. From the road, it was a long brick building with narrow windows, a faded sign, and 2 maple trees that dropped leaves across the ambulance entrance every fall. The lobby smelled of floor wax, coffee, and something sweet the kitchen staff baked on Sundays to make the halls feel less medical. During visiting hours, families came through carrying flowers, magazines, clean sweaters, and guilt they tried to hide inside cheerful voices. But Tessa did not work during visiting hours. She worked after the families left. That was when Mercy Oaks became honest. After 9 o'clock, televisions murmured behind half-closed doors. Call lights glowed red in the dim hallways. Someone always needed help finding the bathroom. Someone always woke from a dream and forgot which decade it was. Someone always asked whether a husband, a sister, or a child had called. Tessa understood that hour. The hour after everyone else went home. She moved through it carefully at first, learning names, routines, fears, misses. Whitcomb liked the hallway light left on because darkness made the room feel too final. Harold Price wanted his radio low enough to hear but not loud enough for anyone to know he was afraid of silence. Mr. Alvarez needed to be reminded every night that the photograph on his dresser was his wife, not his mother. Tessa remembered everything. The nurses noticed. The residents noticed more. She did not rush them when they repeated stories. She did not laugh when they asked the same question twice. She learned to slow her voice before entering rooms, to knock even when the door was open, to let people keep small pieces of dignity in a place where so much had already been decided for them. For a while, the work brought out the best in her. The part of Tessa that could notice suffering before it became noise. The part that knew loneliness had a temperature, a smell, a way of making people hold their breath when footsteps passed their door. Marion Caldwell saw that part first. Marion had been a nurse for 41 years before a stroke weakened her left side and brought her to Mercy Oaks as a resident. She still watched the staff with professional eyes. She knew who cut corners, who was kind only when supervisors were nearby, and who had the hands for the work. One night, Tessa found Marion sitting awake with a book open but unread on her lap. "You're wasting something," Marion said. Tessa looked down at her uniform, thinking she had spilled coffee. "What?" "That gift of yours," Marion said. "You should be in school, a real nursing program, not just night shift work until your back gives out." Tessa almost laughed because the idea sounded too large for someone with $83 once hidden in a coffee can and a life built from temporary jobs. But Marion spoke as if the future were practical, like clean sheets or blood pressure cuffs. Over the next few weeks, Marion asked questions. Had Tessa finished her GED? Did she know the community college had evening classes? Tessa answered carefully, embarrassed by how little she had planned beyond surviving the month. Still, something in her opened. A future with a badge, a license, maybe even a nameplate outside a nurse's station. A future where caring was not something she begged to be noticed for, but something the world recognized as skill. For several nights, Tessa let herself want it. Then Eleanor Whitcomb began crying after midnight. Eleanor was 82, small-boned, proud, and sharper than people assumed. Her son Paul visited every Saturday when his work schedule allowed. He brought groceries she could not eat, crossword books she pretended to enjoy, and stories about his teenage daughter's soccer games. He was awkward with tenderness, but he came. That should have mattered. To Tessa, it did not matter enough. Because Paul left. Every Saturday, he kissed his mother's forehead, promised to call, and walked back through the sliding doors into a life where he could still drive away. Tessa stayed for the night fears, the bathroom trips, the trembling questions Eleanor was too proud to ask while her son stood there. So when Eleanor whispered one night, he said he would call, Tessa felt an old anger rise on the woman's behalf. The phone at the nurse's station rang 20 minutes later. Paul Whitcomb's name lit up on the caller ID. Tessa looked toward Eleanor's room. The old woman was awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting with the painful dignity of someone trying not to hope too hard. Tessa could have transferred the call. She knew that. Instead, she lifted the receiver and kept her voice soft. She finally fell asleep, she said. I'll tell her you called in the morning. Paul sounded disappointed, then relieved. He thanked her. He said he would try again tomorrow. Tessa hung up and stood very still. A small, ugly feeling moved through her, followed by a warmer one that made the first easier to ignore. Eleanor would not be hurt tonight. Eleanor would not hear the tiredness in Paul's voice, or wonder why he had called so late. And Tessa would be the one beside her when she needed comfort. That was the part Tessa did not let herself say. In Eleanor's room, the old woman turned her head when Tessa entered. Was that the phone? Tessa paused only a second. Wrong number, she said. Eleanor closed her eyes. The lie was small enough to survive the night. At least, that was what Tessa told herself. But small lies do not always stay small. Sometimes they learn the shape of the person who told them. Sometimes they discover where a person is weakest and make a home there. The next morning, Tessa found Marian watching her from the doorway of the common room. Nothing in Marian's face said she knew. But Tessa still felt seen. Careful, honey, Marian said, as Tessa passed with a stack of towels. People in places like this need kindness, but they also need the truth. Tessa smiled too quickly. I know, and maybe she did. That was the problem. She knew enough to feel the warning. But when Eleanor reached for her hand later that week and said, You're the only one who really understands, the warning grew quieter. For the first time since her mother died, Tessa had found a room where being needed did not look like a wound. It looked like love, and she wanted to stay inside it. Marian Caldwell did not offer help like charity. That was why Tessa almost trusted it. There was no pity in the old nurse's voice, no soft tilt of the head, no careful expression that made Tessa feel like a problem being handled. Marian spoke to her directly, practically, with the assumption that a person could still become better if someone told them the truth soon enough. You have instincts, Marian said one night, while Tessa changed the linens in the empty room beside hers. But instincts are not the same as training. Tessa smoothed the corner of the sheet. I'm doing fine. You are, Marian said. That's not the point. The point, Marian explained, was that care without boundaries could turn dangerous long before it looked cruel. Loving the work did not give anyone the right to own every decision inside it. Tessa had a gift, but gifts could become excuses when people were too proud to learn discipline. Tessa hated how much the words touched her. A week later, Marian handed her a folded brochure from the community college. Practical nursing prerequisites, evening classes, payment assistance, application deadlines circled in blue pen. I called, Marian said. They still have seats. Tessa stared at the paper as if it might accuse her of wanting too much. For days, she carried the brochure in her backpack. She took it out during breaks and read the same lines again and again. Anatomy, patient ethics, medication safety, clinical practice. Words from a world where care had rules, titles, and doors that opened if a person kept showing up. At first, she showed up. Twice a week, Tessa changed out of her Mercy Oaks uniform in the staff bathroom, rode the bus to campus, and sat in a classroom with fluorescent lights and students who looked younger, cleaner, less exhausted. She wrote carefully in a cheap notebook. When the instructor talked about consent, documentation, and patient autonomy, Tessa listened harder than she wanted to admit. Some nights, she felt proud. Other nights, she felt exposed. In class, being good with lonely people did not make her special. No one knew which residents asked for her by name. No one cared that Eleanor Whitcomb relaxed when Tessa entered the room. That Tessa, the version of Tessa that Mercy Oaks had made important. At school, she was just another tired student. That should have been freeing. Instead, it frightened her. While Tessa was trying to become more than a night aide, Paul Whitcomb began calling earlier and visiting more often. At first, Tessa told herself this was good. Eleanor smiled more on Saturdays. She wore lipstick when Paul brought his daughter, Claire, who was 16 and shy, and brought her grandmother drawings from art class. Tessa helped Eleanor choose a sweater before one visit. She told herself helping was enough. But when Paul arrived, Eleanor's face changed in a way Tessa could not control. The old woman sat straighter. Her voice grew lighter. She asked about Claire's school, Paul's work truck, the neighbor's dog, the small, ordinary world that continued beyond Mercy Oaks without Tessa in it. Tessa stood near the doorway with a laundry bag in her hand, suddenly unnecessary. The feeling was childish. She knew that. It was also unbearable. After Paul left, Eleanor was tired but peaceful. Tessa expected to be asked to sit with her, to hear the worries that came after family visits, to be the one who understood what others missed. But Eleanor only held the picture Claire had drawn and said, "He is trying, isn't he?" Tessa heard the hope in it. Hope had always seemed reckless to her. "He gets busy," Tessa said. Eleanor's smile weakened. "I know. It was not exactly a lie. Paul did get busy. He had work, a daughter, bills, a life that did not pause just because his mother waited in a numbered room." But Tessa knew what she had done. She had taken a fragile moment and placed weight on it. The next week, Clara Hayes noticed. Clara worked the same hall, though she moved through it differently. She was efficient, a little blunt, and not easily impressed by Tessa's gentleness. Clara did not dislike her. That almost made it worse. She simply watched the work, and watching made Tessa nervous. "Paul Whitcomb left 2 messages yesterday," Clara said, checking the log at the nurse's station. Eleanor said she only got 1. Tessa kept her eyes on the medication cart. "I must have missed the second." Clara looked at her. "Then write that down. We can't have family messages disappearing." The word disappearing followed Tessa down the hall. That night, Marion found her in the supply room, standing too long over a shelf of gloves. "You started classes," Marion said. Tessa nodded. "And?" "They're fine." Fine is what people say when they don't want to be known. Tessa almost smiled despite herself. Marion rolled closer, her voice lower. "Do not let this place become the only mirror you trust." Tessa looked away. She wanted to tell Marion that school made her feel small, that Eleanor's need gave her back a shape, that she did not know who she was in rooms where no one reached for her. Instead, she said, "I'm just tired." Then came Eleanor's birthday. Paul mailed a card because he was out of town for work. Claire had drawn flowers around the edges and written in uneven blue ink that she missed her grandmother's stories. The envelope arrived with the afternoon mail and was placed at the nurse's station. Tessa saw it before Clara did. She picked it up. For several seconds, she did nothing. She imagined Eleanor opening it, crying softly, then forgiving Paul for not coming in person. She imagined Paul calling later and Eleanor answering with warmth instead of hurt. She imagined herself standing beside the bed with no wound to soothe. Tessa told herself the card was not enough. A son who mailed love from another town did not understand the empty hours after midnight. If Eleanor hurt, maybe she deserved to know who had actually stayed. So Tessa slid the envelope into the pocket of her cardigan. Not forever, she told herself. Just not tonight. But when Eleanor asked after dinner whether any mail had come, Tessa felt the old split inside her. Shame on one side, hunger on the other. "Not today," she said. Eleanor's face fell. Tessa sat beside her until the old woman reached for her hand. And there it was again. That terrible comfort, being the person left in the room after everyone else had failed to arrive. Tessa held Eleanor's hand and felt sorry, but not sorry enough to give the card back. The first time Tessa saw a family ask about money before they asked about pain, she felt something inside her harden with recognition. It was a Tuesday afternoon, not her usual shift, but Mercy Oaks had called because another aide was sick. Tessa arrived while visiting hours were still open, and the building looked different in daylight. Brighter, louder. Less honest, somehow. Families filled the lobby with flowers, takeout bags, nervous laughter, and the strained affection of people trying to compress love into 40 minutes. In room 118, Harold Price's daughter stood at the foot of his bed with her purse still over her shoulder. Harold was 79, a retired bus mechanic with swollen knuckles and a voice that shook when he was embarrassed. He had spent most of that morning asking whether Denise was coming. When she finally arrived, she kissed his cheek, glanced once at his chart, and began asking about the pension deposit. Tessa was changing the trash liner near the door. She should have stepped out. Instead, she stayed long enough to hear Harold say, "I thought maybe we could talk about Thanksgiving." Denise sighed. "We'll see, Dad. I just need you to sign a few things first." Harold's face changed. Not much. Just enough. Tessa knew that look. It was the face of someone pretending disappointment had not reached them. After Denise left, Harold stared at the ceiling and said, "She's busy." Tessa stood beside his bed and felt the old sentence return from her aunt's kitchen. A hard few years. A problem. A need. Some families, she thought, did not deserve the people waiting for them. That thought should have frightened her. Instead, it comforted her. Because if some families were careless, maybe Tessa had not been wrong about Paul. Maybe Eleanor's sadness was not something Tessa had created, only something she had been brave enough to name. Maybe Mercy Oaks was full of people whose hearts had been left in rooms after visitors took everything useful and went home. Over the next weeks, Tessa began collecting proof. Not official proof. Not the kind that belonged in reports. Private proof. A son who checked his phone while his mother tried to tell him about a dream. A granddaughter who took a photo for social media and left before lunch. A nephew who asked where his uncle kept the checkbook. Tessa watched all of it and made one mistake more dangerous than any single lie. She turned patterns into permission. When a family disappointed someone, it became evidence. When a family tried, but clumsily, Tessa treated the clumsiness as proof they did not care. When someone missed a call, arrived late, or used the wrong tone, she filed it inside herself with every abandonment she had ever survived. Marion noticed the change before anyone else could name it. "You're angry at people you don't know," she told Tessa one night. Tessa was helping Marion sort old nursing pins into a small velvet box. The old woman kept them polished, though she could no longer fasten them with one hand. "I'm angry at what they do," Tessa said. "Sometimes, but not always." Tessa closed the box too sharply. "You don't see them when they leave." "I have watched families leave hospital rooms for 40 years, Marion said. "Some were selfish. Some were scared. Some were poor at showing love, but still trying. If you treat all of them like the worst one, you will hurt the people you think you are protecting." Tessa wanted to respect the warning. She almost did, but then she remembered Harold staring at the ceiling. She remembered Eleanor asking whether Paul had forgotten. She remembered her mother's relatives opening drawers after the funeral, so she nodded, apologized, and did not change. With Eleanor, the shift became quieter. Tessa did not need to invent large cruelties. She only had to choose which truths arrived and which ones were delayed until they no longer felt like truths. When Paul called, Tessa sometimes wrote the message in a way that sounded hurried. When he asked to visit, she mentioned that Eleanor had been tired or anxious or not up for too much emotion. If Eleanor asked whether Paul had called, Tessa did not always say no. Sometimes she said, "He said he would try again," and let the weakness of the sentence do the harm for her. Paul was not a perfect son. That made it easier. He missed things. He worked long hours. He forgot one Wednesday appointment after his truck broke down and did not call until evening. He sounded defensive when Tessa reminded him that his mother waited all day. Tessa took that defensiveness and built a story around it. She began making small changes in the records that governed Eleanor's world. Not dramatic enough to startle anyone. A note that a visit had been declined. A contact preference adjusted after a conversation Eleanor was too confused to remember clearly. A family concern softened until it looked like irritation, not love. The paperwork did not feel like a weapon to Tessa. It felt like housekeeping, clearing away people who hurt more than they helped. The same thing began with Harold Price. After Denise's second tense visit, Tessa found Harold crying with an unsigned form on his lap. He said he did not understand what his daughter wanted from him anymore. Tessa sat with him and said, gently, that sometimes people showed their priorities when money entered the room. The words were not false enough to feel like a lie. That was what made them dangerous. By the end of winter, several residents trusted Tessa with fears they would not tell their families. Tessa carried those fears like keys. She knew where each. Clara Hayes began asking questions again. A visit Eleanor supposedly refused. A birthday card that never appeared in the room. A note in Harold's chart that sounded more like judgment than observation. "You're crossing lines," Clara said at the nurse's station after midnight. Tessa kept her voice low. "I'm listening to them. Listening is not the same as deciding for them." The words were too close to Marion's. That made Tessa hate them. Before she could answer, Penny, the old hallway cat, padded between them and rubbed against Clara's shoe. Eleanor loved that cat. So did Harold. So did half the residents who pretended not to. Penny belonged to no one, which somehow made him safe for everyone. Clara picked him up, scratched behind his ear, and gave Tessa a look that was more worried than angry. "You're good at this job," Clara said, "but you're starting to act like nobody else is allowed to care." Tessa wanted to tell her that nobody else had earned it. Instead, she walked away. That night, Eleanor asked whether Paul still loved her. There were a dozen ways to answer that question with mercy. Tessa chose the one that kept Eleanor closest. "I love you," she said, taking the old woman's hand. "And I'm here." Eleanor cried with relief. Tessa cried too, quietly. After leaving the room, she still had enough conscience to know something had gone wrong. But conscience is easier to ignore when someone's loneliness keeps rewarding the wound that made you who you are. By spring, Tessa no longer waited for Mercy Oaks to make her feel important. She knew how to create the feeling herself. It happened quietly. That was the frightening part. There was no single night when she decided to become the kind of person people would later describe in court. No dramatic confession to a mirror. No sudden cruelty. Just small choices made in a soft voice. Each one easier because the last one had survived. Eleanor asked Tessa to read a letter from Paul because her eyes were tired. Harold asked whether Denise had sounded angry on the phone. Mr. Alvarez asked Tessa if his nephew really needed to see the old bank folder in his drawer, or if family visits always came with requests now. Tessa answered each question as if she were protecting them. Sometimes she was only interpreting. Sometimes she was choosing which part of a message to emphasize. Sometimes she let a pause do more damage than a sentence. She had learned that frightened people listened hardest to the person who seemed calm, and Tessa was very calm. In the middle of the night, calm looked like mercy. The residents began giving her things to hold. Not always money. At first, it was smaller. A daughter's letter they did not want to answer yet. A key to a drawer, an insurance envelope they did not understand, a family photograph turned face down after an argument. Tessa kept these things with an almost religious care. She told herself that families had already mishandled them. She told herself that the residents were safer when she slowed everything down. She told herself that being trusted meant she had earned the right to decide what trust required. Marion would have called that the first real danger. But Marion was recovering from a bad week then, tired and weaker on her left side. Tessa visited her less often. Not because she had stopped loving the old woman, but because Marion's eyes made excuses harder to hold. Clara Hayes kept looking anyway. Clara found patterns the way practical people do, not dramatically, but with pencil marks and dates. A visit Harold supposedly declined on a night Tessa had been assigned to his hall. A message from Paul that appeared in the log 2 days late. A resident's concern about a checkbook written in language too polished for the man who supposedly said it. She brought it to Dr. Miles Keene, the administrator, a man who wore pressed shirts and measured problems by whether they reached his desk before Friday. "I think something is wrong on nights," Clara said. Dr. Keene frowned at the papers. "Wrong how? I don't know yet." That was the worst answer she could have given him. Mercy Oaks was understaffed. Families complained about everything from laundry to billing. Night shift was always messy, and Tessa Ward, everyone agreed, was dependable. Residents asked for her. Families praised her when they still believed she was helping. Supervisors liked employees who filled gaps without making noise. Clara made noise. Tessa did not have to accuse her directly. She only had to look wounded when Dr. Keene asked questions. She only had to say Clara had seemed overwhelmed lately. That Clara was good but sometimes abrupt with residents. That maybe the paperwork confusion came from everyone being tired. None of it was a clear lie. That made it easier to live with. Then Eleanor became upset after Clara reminded her that Paul had called twice that week. He did? Eleanor asked. Clara looked confused. That's what the log says. Eleanor's eyes moved to Tessa, who had just entered with fresh towels. There was 1 second when Tessa could have repaired something. She could have said Clara was right. She could have admitted that messages had been mishandled. She could have let Eleanor be angry with her and still maybe saved the truth before it became too tangled to separate. Instead, she lowered her voice. Clara may have mixed up the dates, she said. It happens. Clara stared at her. Eleanor withdrew into silence. The room changed after that. Not loudly. Just enough that Clara understood she had been moved from coworker to threat. Later, in the linen room, Clara blocked the doorway. Don't do that again, she said. Tessa folded a towel once, then twice. Do what? Make me look careless because you can't explain yourself. Tessa looked up. Maybe you should be careful how you talk to them. Clara's face tightened. You are not the only person who cares about these people. The sentence should have stopped Tessa. Instead, it struck the ugliest place in her. Because part of her had begun to believe the opposite. Not in words, maybe. Not where she could hear herself clearly. But in practice, in choices, in the way she stepped between residents and their families, she had started living as if care belonged to whoever stayed closest. A week later, Clara was called into Dr. Keene's office. There had been complaints, confusion in documentation. A family member upset about a missed message. A resident distressed after a conversation Clara could not remember having. Nothing criminal. Nothing proven. Just enough smoke for management to look for the easiest fire. Tessa saw Clara come out holding her badge clip in one hand. Suspended pending review. The hallway seemed to narrow. For the first time in months, Tessa felt the full weight of what she had done without a story ready to soften it. Clara was innocent. Not perfect, not always gentle, but innocent of this. Tessa could still speak. She knew that. She could walk into Keene's office and say the logs were wrong because of her. She could say messages had been delayed, visits misunderstood, concerns shaped by someone who had no right to shape them. She could give Clara back her name before the rumor finished spreading. But Eleanor called from room 214. Tessa? The voice was thin, frightened, familiar. Tessa stood between Dr. Keene's door and that call light, and the old split opened inside her again. Truth on one side, need on the other. If she told the truth, she would lose Mercy Oaks. She would lose Eleanor's trust. Marion's respect. The only place that had ever made her feel chosen. And if she left, who would protect them from daughters like Denise, sons who called late, nephews with folders, administrators who only cared when complaints became paperwork? That was how she saved herself from the word guilt. She called it protection. She called it staying. She called it love. Because love was the name she had always given to being unable to walk away. Tessa did not go to Dr. Keene. She went to Eleanor. The old woman reached for her hand before Tessa even reached the bed. I heard Clara is in trouble, Eleanor whispered. Was she unkind to us? Tessa looked at the hand holding hers. A decent person would have ended it there. Tessa still knew that. That was what made the moment unforgivable. She was confused, Tessa said. You don't have to worry. I'm here. Eleanor relaxed. Tessa stayed until the old woman slept, then stood in the hallway with Penny brushing against her ankle and Clara's empty station visible down the hall. She felt sick. She felt powerful. And for the first time, she understood that those two feelings could live in the same body without destroying each other. They could even learn to work together. Marion Caldwell did not confront Tessa in front of anyone. That was how Tessa knew it was serious. If Marion had wanted revenge, she could have asked Dr. Keene to come to her room. She could have called for Paul Whitcomb, or Clara Hayes, or anyone with a reason to hate the girl who had turned Mercy Oaks into a place where truth arrived late and trust came damaged. Instead, Marion waited until just after dawn, when the night shift thinned and the morning staff had not yet filled the halls with carts and voices. Tessa, she said from her doorway, come sit with me. Tessa almost said she was busy, but Marion's tone left no room for the kind of lie that sounded like work. Inside the room, the blinds were half open. Pale light touched the framed photographs on Marion's dresser. Marion in a white nursing cap, Marion holding a newborn, Marion younger and stern beside a hospital bed with her hand on a patient's shoulder. Proof that she had spent a life near suffering without believing suffering belonged to her. Tessa stood near the chair. Marion looked at her for a long time. "I know about Clara," she said. Tessa's face went still. Marion did not soften the words. "And I know enough about Eleanor to understand something is wrong." "You don't know everything." "No," Marion said. "But I know the shape of it." That frightened Tessa more than an accusation would have. The shape of it. Not every detail, not every hidden message, not every altered note or delayed truth. Just enough to see the thing Tessa had been building out of loneliness and calling care. Tessa crossed her arms. "They need someone," she said. "They do. Their families don't see them. Sometimes. They leave them here, Marion. They visit when it's convenient. They bring flowers and guilt, and then go home." Marion's eyes did not move away. "And that gives you the right to decide who reaches them?" Tessa looked toward the window. Her throat tightened with anger, but underneath the anger was fear. Marion was not wrong. That was the part Tessa could not forgive her for. "I'm the one here at night," Tessa said. "I know. I'm the one they call when they're scared. I know that too. Then why are you acting like I'm hurting them?" Marion's hand, thin and veined, rested on the arm of her chair. "Because you are." The sentence was quiet. It entered Tessa quietly too, then opened inside her with terrible force. Marion leaned forward as much as her body allowed. Caring for someone does not mean owning them. Tessa looked down. For 1 second, all her defenses failed. She saw Clara walking out with her badge in her hand. She saw Eleanor asking whether Paul still loved her. She saw Harold Price staring at forms he did not understand. She saw herself in the hallway, always arriving at the perfect moment, always standing close enough to be chosen after someone else had been made to look absent. Her eyes burned. "I didn't mean for it to get like this," she whispered. Marion's face changed then. Not into forgiveness, into grief. "I believe that." The mercy of it hurt worse than blame. Marion reached toward the drawer beside her bed and took out an envelope. Inside were notes she had written in careful, slanted handwriting. Dates, names, things residents had said, things Clara had questioned, things Paul had asked about. Not a full case. Not yet. But enough. "I have not given this to Dr. Keene," Marion said. "Not yet." Tessa stared at the envelope. "You're threatening me." "I am giving you a door." Tessa almost laughed, but no sound came. Marion continued. "You go to him today. You tell him Clara did not do this. You correct what can still be corrected. You return what you kept. You let Eleanor hear from her son without you standing between them. You tell the truth before the truth has to drag you by the throat." Tessa shook her head slowly. "You don't understand what will happen." "I know exactly what will happen," Marion said. "You will lose the lie. That is not the same as losing your life." But to Tessa, it felt close. If she told the truth, Mercy Oaks would turn on her. Eleanor would look at her with fear. Harold would stop reaching for her hand. Clara would know. Paul would know. Marion would know everything, not just the shape. And Tessa would be what Lorna had said she was. A problem. A need. A woman who had mistaken being necessary for being loved. Still, she took the envelope Marion offered. For the rest of the morning, it sat in Tessa's locker like a living thing. She finished her shift in a haze. At noon, she should have gone to Dr. Keene. Instead, she walked to room 214. Eleanor was awake, holding Penny against her chest while the old cat tolerated the embrace with patient resignation. "Morning, sweetheart," Eleanor said. "You look tired." Tessa stood in the doorway. In her cardigan pocket was the old birthday card from Paul and Claire, the one she had once told herself she would give back later. The envelope had softened at the corners from being carried too long. She took it out. Eleanor looked at it. "What's that?" Tessa opened her mouth. This was the moment. Not the courtroom. Not the arrest. Not the sentence that would come years later in a room full of people she had harmed. This small room. This old woman. This card. Tessa could still return one piece of stolen love. Then, Eleanor reached for her with the hand not holding Penny. "You're the only one who stayed," she said. And there it was. The sentence Tessa had wanted from someone her whole life. Not because it was true, because she had made it true. Tessa folded the card once, carefully, and slid it back into her pocket. "I'm here," she said. Eleanor smiled with relief. Outside the room, Marian waited at the end of the hall. Tessa saw her. Marian saw the empty hands. Neither woman spoke. They did not need to. The door had been open. Tessa had looked at it, and then she had closed it herself. After Marian saw the empty hands, Tessa stopped sleeping. Not completely. She still closed her eyes for an hour here, 20 minutes there, sitting upright in the break room with vending machine light shining across her face. But real sleep, the kind that loosened the body and let a person forget herself, no longer came. Every sound in Mercy Oaks became a warning. A phone ringing at the nurse's station. A door opening behind her. The soft roll of Marian's wheelchair near the common room. Even Penny's paws against the floor made Tessa turn too quickly, as if the old cat had carried some accusation down the hall. Marian did not speak to her for 2 days. That silence was worse than anger. Tessa watched her from a distance. Marian ate less. She wrote more. Sometimes she sat near the window with a pen in her good hand, building something Tessa could not stop without admitting she knew what it was. By the third night, fear had changed shape. It was no longer the fear of being wrong. It was the fear of being removed. That was when Tessa made the choice that took her past the last remaining line. She went to Dr. Miles Keene before Marian could. She did not accuse Marian. Not directly. Direct accusations were messy, and Tessa had learned the power of concern. She stood in Keene's office with her hands clasped and her voice lowered, speaking like someone reluctant to say anything unkind. "I'm worried about Mrs. Caldwell," she said. Keene looked up from a staffing schedule. Tessa told him Marian had seemed confused about dates, that she had been mixing up residence stories, that she was under stress after Clara's suspension, that maybe the stroke had affected more than Marian wanted to admit. Each sentence sounded careful. Each sentence was poison. Dr. Keene leaned back, tired already. Mercy Oaks had too many problems, and not enough people willing to solve them quietly. Tessa was quiet. Marian, lately, was not. "I'll keep an eye on it," he said. Tessa nodded as if relieved. Outside his office, she gripped the hallway rail until her knuckles paled. She knew what she had done. Marian was not confused. Marian was not imagining patterns. Marian had seen through her, and Tessa had used the one thing Marian could not defend herself from easily: age. The shame should have stopped her. Instead, it made her move faster. That afternoon, Keene spoke to Marian with the gentle tone staff used when they wanted an elderly person to doubt her own certainty. Marian listened, without interrupting. She asked him whether Tessa had come to him first. Keene did not answer quickly enough. Marian understood. The next morning, she asked to use the phone in the activities room. She called Paul Whitcomb first. Not to accuse, to ask questions. Had his mother received the card from Claire? Had he been told Eleanor refused visits? Had he ever heard the phrase, "too emotional for visitors," from anyone besides Tessa? Paul's answers came slowly, then quickly, then with a silence so heavy Marian could hear him breathing through it. After Paul, Marian called Clara Hayes. Clara answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was harder than before, but it cracked when Marian said, "I owe you an apology." They met 2 days later in the church office of Reverend Amos Bell, because Marian did not trust Mercy Oaks anymore, and Clara refused to step back into the building without a witness. Paul came with a folder of printed call logs and bank notices he had been too ashamed to show anyone. He had believed his mother was rejecting him. He had believed himself guilty of neglect, because Tessa had shaped every absence into proof. Clara brought copies of schedules and notes she had kept after the first inconsistencies. Marian brought her envelope. None of it was enough alone. Together, it began to breathe. A missed message here, a changed preference there. A visit marked declined when Paul had been sitting in the parking lot waiting for confirmation. Harold Price's daughter, Denise, had been careless and selfish at times, but even her complaints now revealed something larger. Residents across Mercy Oaks had been made to fear the people connected to them. Not all at once, not in a way that looked violent from the outside, but steadily, intimately. By the time Dr. Keene realized the problem was larger than staff conflict, the story had already left his office. Paul had spoken to another family. Clara had spoken to a former supervisor. Marion had given her notes to someone who knew how to preserve them properly. Detective Laura Finch arrived at Mercy Oaks on a gray afternoon with a plain folder and a voice that did not rise. Tessa saw her from the end of the hall. For 1 second, she considered walking out the side door. Then Eleanor called her name. Room 214 was dim, the curtains drawn against the afternoon glare. Eleanor sat in bed with Penny curled at her feet. Paul stood beside the window, his face pale with the kind of grief that had not decided yet whether it was anger. On the blanket in front of Eleanor lay the old birthday card. Opened. Flattened. Read too late. Eleanor looked at Tessa, and the expression on her face did what no charge, no warning, no envelope from Marion had done. It made Tessa see the victim. Not a lonely woman who needed her. Not proof that families failed. Not a room where Tessa could be chosen. A personne. An old woman whose last years had been bent around someone else's hunger. Did you keep him from me? Eleanor asked. Tessa tried to answer. The old reflex rose first. The soft voice, the wounded eyes, the careful explanation about protection, confusion, bad timing, love. But Paul was there. Marion was in the doorway. Clara stood behind Detective Finch, her face tight, her name still bruised but no longer silent. There was nowhere left for Tessa's version of the story to live. Eleanor looked down at the card again. I don't know who to believe anymore, she whispered. That was the sentence that broke the room. Tessa felt it as abandonment, even then. Not Eleanor's abandonment, but her own. The bed, the hand, the voice that had once called for her, all of it slipping away. Everyone was taking Eleanor from her. That was still how the wound translated the truth. Detective Finch said Tessa's name. No one grabbed her, no one shouted. No one gave her the drama that might have made her feel persecuted instead of exposed. They simply walked her down the hall. Residents watched from doorways. Staff stepped aside. Penny followed for a few feet, then stopped near Marion's chair. At the exit, Tessa turned once. Mercy Oaks looked smaller than it had ever looked before. Not a sanctuary. Not a home. Not a place where need could be mistaken for love. Just a building full of people she had harmed while telling herself she was the only one who cared. And by the time the doors opened, even Tessa knew there was no path back through them. At trial, the state did not begin with Tessa Ward's childhood. That mattered. Her defense attorney spoke of Darrow Street, of a sick mother, of a father who left, of a girl who had learned too young how to keep a house alive. Those things were true. No one in that courtroom could honestly say Tessa's life had been easy. But the prosecution began with names. Eleanor Whitcomb, Harold Price, Clara Hayes, Marion Caldwell, Paul Whitcomb, and 5 other residents whose families had entered Mercy Oaks' believing age would make their loved ones fragile, not invisible. The prosecutor did not need to make Tessa sound monstrous. The facts did not require decoration. She had placed herself between vulnerable people and the relationships that still belonged to them. She had treated loneliness like an opening. She had turned trust into access, access into control, and control into damage that could not be measured only in bank statements. Eleanor testified for less than 12 minutes. Her voice shook so badly that the judge asked twice if she needed a break. She said she still woke some mornings unsure whether she had forgotten something important or whether someone had once made her forget it. She said she missed the person she had been before she learned to doubt every kind hand. Paul sat behind her with his head lowered. He had not been a perfect son. He said that himself. He had missed calls. He had worked late. He had let embarrassment and exhaustion make him defensive. But imperfection was not abandonment. And Tessa had used every ordinary weakness in him to build a wall between a mother and her child. Harold Price did not testify in person. His statement was read by his daughter Denise, who cried before reaching the second paragraph. She admitted she had come to Mercy Oaks too often with paperwork, and not enough patience. She admitted she had hurt her father in ways Tessa had been able to use, but she also said Tessa had not healed that failure. She had fed it, shaped it, and made an old man believe money was the only reason his daughter still came through the door. Clara Hayes spoke without crying. That made her testimony harder to hear. She described losing her job, then losing friends who did not know what to believe, then losing the ease with which she had once walked into a room and assumed the truth would protect her. She looked at Tessa only once. "You knew," Clara said. "That is what I cannot forgive." Marion Caldwell was the last witness before sentencing. She rolled her wheelchair to the front, placed one hand on the Bible, and gave her testimony in the calm voice of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching pain reveal character. Tessa had gentle hands, Marion said. That was never the question. The question was what she believed those hands gave her the right to hold. Tessa began to cry then, not loudly, not in a way that interrupted the court. Tears simply gathered and fell while Marion spoke of care, boundaries, and the difference between being needed and being trusted. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the courtroom did not feel victorious. There was no victory large enough for what had been broken. Tessa Ward was sentenced to 35 years in state prison for exploitation of vulnerable adults, fraud, falsified records, and obstruction. The judge noted that the financial losses were serious, but he did not call them the deepest wound. He said the greater harm was the deliberate isolation of people who depended on caregivers to preserve their dignity, not replace their families. He said Tessa had not acted in one moment of panic, but through a sustained pattern of choices, corrections refused, warnings ignored, and truth withheld. He acknowledged her childhood. Then he made clear what it could not do. A painful past might explain the wound, he said, but it could not erase the harm done after a person knew better. Tessa had been offered help by teachers, by coworkers, by Marion Caldwell, by the very profession that could have given her a lawful way to care. Again and again, she had chosen the version of love that gave her control. The sentence was not written to satisfy anger. It was written to name responsibility. When the bailiff stepped forward, Tessa looked back once, not at the reporters, not at the judge, at Marion. For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say she was sorry. Maybe she was. Maybe some part of her had been sorry for a long time, even while she kept choosing the thing that made apology meaningless. Marion did not look away, but she did not rescue her. That may have been the final mercy. In the months after the trial, Mercy Oaks changed its policies. New staff were trained. Family communication logs were audited. Dr. Keene resigned before the civil hearings finished. Clara Hayes was cleared publicly, though public clearance could not return the months when people had whispered her name with doubt attached. Eleanor moved to a smaller care home closer to Paul and Claire. She kept the birthday card in a drawer, not because it comforted her, but because she said forgetting would feel like being stolen from twice. Penny, the old hallway cat, was adopted by Marion after Mercy Oaks closed the wing where room 214 had been. Some stories end with a monster in a cell. This one did not. Tessa Ward was not born a monster. She was a child, left too long beside a sickbed, a girl who learned that usefulness could feel like love, a woman who mistook dependency for devotion until she could no longer tell care from possession. But understanding where the wound began does not forgive what the wound became. Tessa had once feared being left behind. In the end, she made other people feel abandoned inside rooms full of people who still loved them. And that was the crime no sentence could fully repair.